In this series, I've been covering the greatest blitz match ever played. It was played between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja. It was the Banter Blitz Cup Final 2020, and Magnus just lost the last game, game 7, now going down 4-3 in the match. So he's under pressure. He's losing to a 16-year-old kid. What is going on? He's world champion. So Alireza kicks off with e4 again, and in the last game with black, Magnus went c5, Sicilian, deviating from two Alekines. Here he went for the Alekine again, he goes back for it. So we had these moves here, same as we saw in those other two Alekine games. d6 from Magnus, knight to f3, the pawn captured, the knight retook, and now g6. Magnus goes for this system. Bishop d3 was now played by Alireza. In their first Alekine game, he went bishop to e2, bishop g7, castles from both players. This rook came to the e-file, and Magnus challenged the knight with knight d7. And once again, Alireza drops the knight back to f3, so that after c5, which Magnus played, he can repeat this idea of going pawn to c4, kicking the knight, and then going pawn to d5, taking the space. Now in the last game in this line, Magnus played pawn to b5 immediately, a good move, and I think a slightly better move than what he played in this game. So he took on d3 immediately in this game. The queen recaptured, now he went pawn to b5. So Alireza captured that one. This is a gambit, but what Magnus is getting in compensation is rapid development of his pieces and no developing issues, but he's a pawn down. So knight c3 from Alireza. Now we had bishop to b7, and now a really tricky move from Alireza. He goes bishop to g5, pressuring this pawn here, saying to white, okay, you can recapture on d5, but what about your problems here? And you don't want to play f6. This is a really ugly move. You block in your own bishop. So instead, Magnus in an instant played knight takes on d5, which is the best move here. And as soon as he played it, he goes, I'm missing bishop e7, and he was just doubting himself at times in these games. He was a bit rattled, but actually his judgment was spot on, because if you take with this bishop on e7, you could have a line like this, and this is what Magnus started to calculate, but actually black is doing fine here. After you chop on f3, rook d2, although you're a pawn down, you've got tons of compensation. This is a better minor piece. Black is doing fine, it's roughly level. So Alireza didn't go in for this. I should say as well that if he takes on d5, you get very similar lines to that. And we saw something similar in the game. So knight a4 played by Alireza. He targets this one. Magnus goes rook to c8 defending. And now Alireza takes on e7. And you could take back immediately here. This isn't what Magnus played. And you could have a line like this. You get a very similar thing to the game where you have this rough equality after rook to b8. Instead, Magnus flicked in this pawn to c4 move first. And Alireza hadn't seen this, but he responded very well. So he goes queen to e4 here. And although you're putting it on the same line as the bishop, if the knight now recaptures, opening up the attack of this bishop, well, you can actually take here on b7. White is doing fine, a tiny bit better perhaps. Now coming back here, Magnus didn't take on e7 with the knight, he took with the queen. And we now had this mass liquidation of pieces. The bishop captured on f3, shattering the pawns, and now rook to b8 was played, targeting this weak pawn. So rook c1 came, targeting Magnus's weakness. We had these exchanges here, and we reached this endgame position. Black is a pawn down, but has compensation by the fact that these are shattered and has the better minor piece than the knight. When you have pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop generally is a bit better, and when the board is so open like this. So what would happen? Would it be a boring draw or a result for one player? Let's find out, and if you're enjoying this video and want to see more in the series, do hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. So here Magnus played pawn to a5. Now I should note that he didn't take on b2 because he didn't see an obvious draw in this line. He could have done this, and after rook recaptures, say rook takes on a7, rook d8, he's doing fine really. It should be a drawn position, but he just wasn't completely sure with the outside passer. So he didn't do this, he played pawn a5 instead. This allowed the pawn to be saved and not be taken by the rook. Now Alireza goes b3, saving his own pawn, and the game goes on from here. So rook g5 check was played, king f1, rook h5 hits this pawn, Alireza comes back, and we could have ended up having a draw from this position, but Alireza wanted more. So after the pawn was attacked again, here he goes pawn h4. Alireza says, right, let's go for a win. So now bishop f6 played, hits the rook, hits the pawn, but the rook drops back defending. The rook came to the d-file. King e2 from Alireza covers this square. Now this one came to the d-file as well. And rook c2 dropped back, again covering the d2 square, stopping the black invasion on the 7th. And again we could have had a drawn position, so rook h5 played. This one came back to c4. And now Magnus thinks, I have to go for a win. I can't keep begging for a draw. So he goes king to g7. Both players fighting. That's what we love about these guys. So rook to c5 played now from Alireza. So he offers this pawn to be taken by Magnus, but in exchange he wants to go after this a5 pawn. So Magnus now brings the other rook up to the 5th. We had this exchange here, and knight b6 was played, not only hitting the rook, but re-manoeuvring to this critical c4 square. Rook h5 played now, the knight came to c4. The bishop captured on h4, that pawn was indefensible at this point, and Alireza noted in his stream, maybe I shouldn't have played h4, but okay, the pawns are still level, Alireza has the connected ones here, still anyone's game. And Magnus expected rook to e5 here, and he felt it should just be a very level position really, not so much to play for. But instead of playing rook to e5 here, Alireza goes rook e8. Not a bad move, but it keeps pieces on the board. We now had rook g5, and this was actually a mouse slip. Magnus meant rook d5, but it wasn't such a bad one because it threatens to now invade here potentially. So king f1 played to cover, rook d5 now played. The rook came to a8, attacking this pawn twice, but the bishop now swings back to d8. This is where the bishops can be so powerful in these kind of open board positions, and it also clears the way for this h-pawn now, as we note. And this is where Magnus says, right, I've got to play for a win. I don't know on what justification, but let's play for one. So knight e3 played, rook d7, knight c4 comes back, hits the pawn, rook d5 defends it again, and after knight e3, Alireza's inviting the draw, but rook d4 played from Magnus. He doesn't want it. Now the knight came to c4 and pawn h5 played, so Magnus chucks this a-pawn. It was taken with the knight. Pawn h4 from Magnus. Knight c6 forks the two pieces. What do you do? This one's attacked twice, so how do you actually save that bishop and save your rook? What would you play here? So rook d1 check, but what are you doing after king to e2? Well, here's the trick. Pawn to h3 is what would have been played. Now this line didn't happen on the board, but now if you take the rook, this pawn's going through. So we didn't have this. After this move of knight to c6, rook to d1 check, Alireza went king g2 instead. He saw this tactic, he stayed with the pawn. We had bishop to b6 now from Magnus, so he's looking at this pawn. He wants rook d2 soon, so rook a6 hits this bishop, bishop c5, and now pawn b4 kicks it off this dangerous diagonal. It comes into d6 here. And now Alireza plays a bit of an imprecise move. He pushes b5 and gives up the c5 square again for the bishop. Better here would have been something like, say, rook to a7 or rook to a8. Now with rook d2 from Magnus, you can swing to the d-file, stop this bishop from moving, or you lose the rook behind it. But instead of playing this, Alireza pushed b5. He's very low on time here. Rook d2 from Magnus. Again, he wants bishop c5 here. So rook a4 came, attacking this pawn as a counter threat. And now there was actually a really powerful move for black here. Bishop to g3, using the pin of this pawn and defending the h-pawn here. Really nice stuff. Instead, Magnus went bishop to c5. Of course, this is blitz chess. And I should say that Magnus had about 45 seconds here. Alireza only about 16. So he's really under pressure on the clock, Alireza. So the pawn was captured. Magnus picked up here, king h3. And now he picked up on a2. Plus this pawn's blocked. So it's really tough for Alireza now. We had rook to c4 hitting the bishop. It dropped back in here. The knight came to e5 now, and the rook came to b2, coming behind this passed pawn. And now it's just so hard for Alireza to coordinate. The bishop's better than the knight, his pawns are split. He goes rook c6, attacking the bishop in time pressure, but Magnus simply picks up here and defends his bishop in doing so. So knight c4 now played, attacking the bishop. It's centralized on d4, such a powerful piece. The knight came to d6, rook d5 hit it again, and it's just so difficult to jump around the board in this time pressure. So knight e4 played, king h6, prepared f5, came away from any checks here. We had rook to c7 hitting the pawn, it came to f5, the knight dropped back to g3, and now bishop e5 double attacked both of these pieces. So bishop b7 played, rook d3 hits the pawn, king g2, rook d2 check. I mean, this thing is just next to impossible to defend with no time on the clock. Rook f2 hit the pawn here, rook b3 defended, king g5 marched in, rook a3, and now king f4. The pawn is doubled attacked. You really can't even move the knight. So we had knight h1, a miserable corner move, but now of course you just take here with check. The knight blocked, no time for Alireza, he drops his rook. So Magnus strikes back, he evens up the match 4 apiece. If you want to see the whole playlist of games, click here, and subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.